Hello, and welcome back to High Score. In this video, I'll be breaking down how sound is used in video games to transport the player to a new dimension, connect them to an empty avatar, and make them care about objectives and goals that would otherwise mean nothing to them. In addition to this, I'll cover the use of cutscenes within games and how they can have a knock-on effect on the player's experience. Creating atmospheres. Creating a mood or atmosphere is one of the most basic aims of any type of composition. It's a universal concept which can be found in classical music, movie soundtracks, and, of course, video game music. It isn't particularly difficult to achieve either, with basic musical concepts such as chord progressions, the choice of instruments, and time signatures going a long way to effectively changing the player's surroundings. Let's look at an example of how these concepts combine to create a particular atmosphere. Listen to this track and think about where you might expect to hear it. What would the level or world where it plays look like? And why do you think that? Before I tell you where the music actually plays, let's do some really basic musical analysis. The echoing xylophone accompaniment makes the piece sound empty and vast, almost as if playing in a huge cavern, or in deep space. The time signature is a quick 3/4, 3 crotchet beats per bar. This gives it a lilting, dance-like sound, but the chord progression makes it clear this isn't something you'd dance a waltz to dressed in your ball gown. The weird whooshy instrument you can hear in the background is called a theremin and sounds very ghostly, for good reason. This track is taken from Super Mario Galaxy's Ghostly Galaxy. This world is set in deep space and hosts a haunted mansion, haunted candles, and haunted ghosts. Most of the context was handed to us through the music without the need for any visuals, but remember the player will usually experience both of these simultaneously. The music and visuals combine to create a coherent experience. Oh, and for anyone who doesn't have perfect pitch, the first 4 notes of this piece are D, E, A, D. I'd like to play another example from a more recent title. Manifold Garden is a physics-based puzzle game released last year for PC and PlayStation 4. The player must manipulate gravity as they explore a non-Euclidean world based on optical illusions and impossible structures. To accompany this, the player uses an ambient soundtrack which fades in and out as players solve puzzles. This footage was taken towards the end of the game and shows the player completing the final puzzle in an area. Notice how the music changes as the player progresses, and how these changes are also reflected in the game's visuals. The combination of visuals with music can sometimes be overwhelming, especially in games which carry a legacy or when the player's expectations are high. In these cases, moments become memorable and will usually be one of the first things that the player recalls about the game. Various other musical concepts can be used to create certain types of atmosphere. For example, a track with little instrumentation that plays only occasionally may give the impression of an empty landscape or ruined environment. At the other end of the spectrum, a battle theme which plays loud percussion and seems to change time signature and tone irregularly will create a chaotic, hectic atmosphere for the player to fight through. In addition, sudden changes in music can be used to shock the player, creating tension within the gameplay. While music is often used to match visuals, it can also deliberately clash against them. Using a slow, peaceful lullaby while the player battles against a huge mechanical opponent will create a special type of atmosphere where the player is caught in the middle of two very different ideas. The mood could be complicated even further by narrative points or certain visual effects. Building a universe. Moods and atmospheres are non-tangible. Players can't reach out and touch their hazy dream state at the beginning of a game. Neither can they grab onto the inspirational march they hear before the beginning of the final level. And while they cannot physically interact with the game world, they can connect to it in a physical manner through their avatar, the character they choose to play as. Music can be used to create realistic and believable environments. This is especially useful in titles which aim to represent a historical or cultural setting, such as the Assassin's Creed series, which is set in various historical periods. Using music which is associated with these locations or eras will aid the player in believing their surroundings. Of course, this only works if the world they are trying to represent actually existed in the first place. Many composers face the challenge of writing music for a brand new environment. How do they reference cultures and environments which never existed in the first place? Well, it's actually surprisingly simple. In his article on writing the music for Wolfenstein: The New Order, composer Ravi Krishnaswamy says, "Developers are gods of the worlds they build, and their alternative histories do not need to conform to any logic, as long as they deliver a compelling and immersive gaming experience." The New Order sees the player control rebels in a world where Nazi Germany won the Second World War. Krishnaswamy had to imagine how the musical world would have developed into the 1960s in a reality that never existed. In doing so, he creates a new reality, separate to the one we are familiar with. He does this by basing the music loosely on real genres, like rock and roll, and bands, most notably the Beatles, but changing them significantly to match the cultural setting they are now being heard in. On a more basic level, the soundtrack of particular areas within games will help players identify that area more easily. We can extend this concept to characters and sublocations within a larger area. For example, players who hear the Gormott theme from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 will not only think about that area as part of the whole game, but also the unique characters, stores, and cutscenes which can be found in the location. This is particularly helpful in large, open-world games like Xenoblade, allowing the player to quickly identify their surroundings. Thematic material can also create or develop a game's lore effectively without having to state it too obviously. It can be used alone or in conjunction with visual symbolism to develop a world's history. This is particularly effective when the lore isn't essential to the game's narrative, but instead simply creates a more believable culture of which the player becomes a part. The world begins with you. Let's briefly look back to the previous video at Jesper Juhl's definition of video game. He says, "The player feels emotionally attached to the outcome and the consequences of the activity are negotiable. Emotional attachment is one of the most important parts of any story-driven game. After all, if you don't want to save the princess, are you really going to trek all the way to another castle? This is where the player-avatar connection comes in. By making the player care about the character they're controlling, they will also begin to share their goals, feel the weight of their responsibilities, and, in some cases, take on aspects of their personality or character. In creating a relatable avatar, developers make the player care about their actions. They'll think more carefully about diving headfirst into battle, before choosing to sacrifice their partner for the greater good, before choosing to destroy one world to save another, and so on. There are various ways in which developers can strengthen the player-avatar connection. Creating relationships with other characters is common, as are empty avatars, characters which are designed with little to no personality of their own, allowing the player to mirror themselves in-game. Games often also feature extensive physical customization options, allowing them to mould their avatar into their desired look. This connection isn't strictly relevant, but it does present a unique scenario when games allow players to choose their own soundtrack, such as the latter entries in the Grand Theft Auto series. In these games, players can choose from multiple fictional radio stations, each presenting a certain genre of music. This scenario presents the player with a choice. Do they choose the radio station their avatar would find most enjoyable? In this series case, that would most likely be a hip-hop or rap station. Or do they choose music they themselves would most like to listen to? Whichever decision the player makes, the result is one person's style of music being projected onto another person. This is one way in which an avatar's personality can merge with the player's. Other ways include more physical tics, such as stances or mannerisms, or speech patterns and catchphrases. Cutscenes. Cutscenes are points of heavy narrative or world-building importance, and often limit player input. They usually take the form of dialogue between characters, or a cinematic scene, which plays out with no player input whatsoever. Many cutscenes use some form of musical backing for various effects. Cutscenes are often criticised for breaking immersion and believability by taking control away from the player. They can, however, be an efficient way of conveying information in a succinct form, so developers consider their use carefully. Too many, and the player will lose interest. Too few, and they may become confused or unmotivated. Some games allow players to skip cutscenes and advance dialogue quickly. Many cutscenes use pre-existing music from elsewhere within the game. Doing so will bring existing connotations to the scene, such as location or character themes. Using remixed versions can imply connections and build lore more subtly, as is the case in some Zelda cutscenes, which I'll discuss next week. As with the previous examples, cutscene tracks will often be composed to match the visual aspect and tone of the cutscene itself. In some cases, music continues to play after the cutscene ends for additional effect. There are two particularly strong examples of this I'd like to share. The first is perhaps the most well-known plot twist in the history of gaming, but nevertheless, if you're still trying to dodge spoilers for the 1997 Final Fantasy VII, you might want to look away for the next few minutes. The player controls Cloud, your typical edgy mercenary, as they attempt to stop Sephiroth from summoning the meteor spell which will destroy their planet. It's obviously much more complex than that. One of the major party members, Aerith, develops a bond with Cloud. She follows the antagonist to an abandoned city to pray for help, before the game begins a peaceful cutscene when Cloud catches up. the main point of tension from that cutscene is the character death. In any context, the player will be shocked, confused, hurt, any combination of these emotions. In normal circumstances, they'd need time and space to move on from the grief and come to terms with loss. Here, the game immediately throws them into a boss fight. Not only does this force the player into battle while grieving, but the death cutscene's music continues to play throughout the battle. They are constantly reminded of their loss as they fight, finding no relief from the change in atmosphere. This not only affects the player's emotional state, but also increases the difficulty of the battle itself, as they struggle to balance logic with emotion. The final example I want to share with you today comes from Fire Emblem Three Houses. This is a bit more recent, so if you want to avoid spoilers for the ending of the Golden Deer route, then now's the time to look away. Three Houses allows players to follow one of 4 stories, each interlocking as they progress towards their own unique, happy ending, as happy as killing all of your school friends can be. The Golden Deer route sees the player team up with strategist Claude as they attempt to stop the Imperial Empire from conquering the land. Predictably, things escalate, and the final chapter of the route sees your group preparing to face off against a god-slaying nemesis who wields the power to destroy the entire world. These games do like their OTT stories.
A military force bearing the crest of flames on its banner marches west to Garrigmach from Shambhala, attacking nearby cities along the way. Rhea informs the Alliance that the enemy's general is none other than the ancient Fell King Nemesis. And so the Alliance army prepares for their final battle, hoping to put an end to Fodlan's blood-stained history.
The battle is preceded by multiple cutscenes, which would each normally use their own track. In this case, however, A Vow Remembered plays throughout. It also plays during each loading screen. This creates a constant build-up of hype towards the final battle. Conclusion. Music and sound in any media is used to create particular atmospheres or moods. Simply by listening to musical properties such as instrumentation or tonality, players can form an idea of their surroundings and the narrative context in which they find themselves. In addition to atmosphere, soundtracks can also help the player identify their surroundings. Particular musical styles or genres can help the player place themselves within a time or location throughout history. It can also be used to create brand new worlds for them to believe in. One of the most crucial parts in creating an immersive and believable reality is nurturing a player-avatar connection. In doing so, players will take on the responsibilities and burdens of the character they control, and this will cause them to think more carefully about their actions. Allowing players some control over the soundtrack can add another layer of complexity to this relationship. Cutscenes are used to strengthen the player-avatar bond, and are also an efficient way to convey narrative and plot points. Developers must balance their use against the lack of player control and possible loss of immersion. The use of music during cutscenes can help strengthen their messages. Here are my sources and music credits for this video. As usual, if you can't find the answer to a question here, or simply don't want to spend 3 days trawling through boring academic papers, drop me a message through any of the social media platforms and I'll try to help. Next week we move on to our first case study, although technically I'm cheating the term by looking at 2 games. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but for 30 minutes next Saturday, that's exactly what I'll be doing. I'll see you then.